At just 14 years old, Marie Antoinette left her home in Austria. She was sent to France to marry the future King Louis XVI. The marriage was meant to create peace between two powerful European families. Marie arrived in France as a young princess. She was beautiful, elegant, and completely unprepared for the world waiting for her. At Versailles, everything was magnificent. The palace was filled with gold, music, luxury, and hundreds of people watching every move of the royal family. Marie was expected to behave perfectly. She was expected to produce an heir, and she was expected to become the perfect French queen. But life at Versailles was not as glamorous as it appeared. Every mistake became gossip. Every dress became a political statement. Every word could become a rumor. Marie was still a teenager, but the French people were already watching her, and many of them believed she represented everything they disliked about the monarchy. Her marriage to Louis was also difficult at first. They were young, shy, and under enormous pressure. For years, the marriage remained without an heir. The pressure became even greater. Then, eventually, Louis and Marie had children. But by then, France itself was changing. The country was facing enormous financial problems. Food prices were rising. Ordinary people were struggling. And the royal court continued to live in extraordinary luxury. Marie became one of the most recognizable women in Europe. But her image began turning against her. Rumors spread that she was wasteful, selfish, and completely disconnected from ordinary people. Some of the stories were exaggerated. Others were based on real royal extravagance. But the public perception was becoming impossible to control. Then came a moment that would change everything. The French Revolution began. The world Marie knew started collapsing around her. The palace that had once represented absolute power was suddenly surrounded by anger. And the young Austrian princess who had once entered Versailles as a future queen was about to discover how quickly a crown could disappear. The world around Marie Antoinette was changing faster than she could understand. For years, she had lived inside the magnificent walls of Versailles. But outside the palace, France was struggling. The country was deeply in debt. Bread was becoming more expensive, and ordinary families were finding it harder to survive. Anger toward the monarchy was growing, and Marie had become one of its easiest targets. She was born in Austria. She was young. She was fashionable. And she lived inside one of the most extravagant courts in Europe. To many people, she became a symbol of everything they believed was wrong with the monarchy. Stories about her spending spread throughout France. Some were exaggerated. Some were completely false. But by now, her reputation hardly mattered. The public had already made up its mind. Then, in 1789, the French Revolution began. Crowds gathered in Paris. The Bastille was attacked, and the authority of the old monarchy began to collapse. Louis XVI tried to maintain control, but events were moving beyond him. Marie understood that her family was in danger. She became increasingly involved in political discussions. She secretly communicated with supporters of the monarchy, and she desperately tried to protect her husband and children. But Versailles was no longer safe. In October 1789, an enormous crowd marched from Paris toward the palace. Thousands of people surrounded Versailles. The royal family was trapped. The palace that had once seemed untouchable was suddenly surrounded by angry citizens. Marie remained inside, trying to stay calm. But the danger was real. The royal family was eventually forced to leave Versailles. They were taken to Paris and moved into the Tuileries Palace. For Marie, this was a devastating change. She had gone from living in one of Europe's most magnificent palaces to living under constant observation. Guards watched the family. Revolutionaries watched the palace. And the royal couple had very little freedom. But Marie refused to simply surrender. She began considering a desperate plan. If the royal family could escape France, perhaps they could reach friendly territory, raise support, and return with enough power to restore the monarchy. It was an enormous gamble, and in 1791, the family attempted to escape. They traveled secretly through the night, hoping to reach the border. For a moment, it seemed that they might succeed. But then, someone recognized the king. The royal family was stopped at Varennes. Their escape had failed. They were taken back to Paris. But something had changed forever. The French people no longer saw Louis as a king trying to protect his country. They saw him as a ruler who had tried to abandon it. Anne-Marie, once the glamorous queen of Versailles, was now viewed by many as an enemy of the revolution. The walls around the monarchy were closing in. Anne-Marie could feel it. The crown was still on her head, but the power behind it was disappearing day by day. After the failed escape at Varennes, nothing was ever the same again. Marie Antoinette had hoped that leaving Paris would save her family. Instead, it destroyed what little trust remained between the royal family and the revolution. The people no longer believed that Louis XVI could be trusted. Anne-Marie was increasingly seen as a foreign enemy. The situation became even more dangerous. In 1792, France went to war with Austria. Marie was born in Austria, and revolutionaries began accusing her of secretly helping France's enemies. They called her the Austrian. Rumors spread that she was working against the revolution. The royal family's position became almost impossible. Then, on August 10, 1792, the Tuileries Palace was attacked. The royal family was forced to seek protection from the Legislative Assembly. But protection did not last. The monarchy was suspended, and the royal family was imprisoned. Marie Antoinette was no longer a queen living inside a palace. She was a prisoner. The family was eventually taken to the Temple prison. Their world had become incredibly small. No grand ceremonies. No magnificent palace halls. No royal celebrations. Only guards, stone walls, and uncertainty. Then came the darkest moment. Louis XVI was put on trial. He was accused of betraying France. Marie could only watch as the man she had married as a teenager faced the judgment of the revolution. Louis was executed in January 1793. Marie was now a widow, and her position became even more dangerous. She was separated from her children. Her son remained in prison. Her daughter was still very young. Anne-Marie was transferred to the conciergerie, a much harsher prison in Paris. There, she waited for her own trial. She had lost her husband, her crown, her palace, her friends, and almost everyone who had once protected her. But Marie still had one thing: her composure. Even in prison, she tried to remain dignified. Her final days were filled with fear, but also with remarkable courage. On October 14, 1793, Marie Antoinette was brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The woman who had once been Queen of France now stood before a court that wanted her condemned. The accusations were severe. She was blamed for crimes against the nation, and even for things that had little connection to reality. The trial was quick. The outcome was almost certain. Marie Antoinette was found guilty and sentenced to death. The next morning, she was dressed in a simple white gown. Her hair was cut short, and she was placed in a cart. She was taken through the streets of Paris. The crowds that once admired the Queen now watched her final journey. She had entered France as a 14-year-old princess. She had become one of the most famous women in Europe. And now, she was traveling toward the guillotine. At the end of her journey, there was no palace, no crown, no royal ceremony, only history waiting to remember her. Marie Antoinette's final journey through Paris was almost impossible to imagine. Only a few years earlier, she had been surrounded by luxury at Versailles. Now, she sat in an open cart. surrounded by guards, while thousands of people watched. She wore a simple white dress. Her hair had been cut short, and the woman who had once been Queen of France looked almost unrecognizable. But Marie remained composed. She knew where the journey was leading. The guillotine. The streets were filled with people. Some shouted insults. Others simply watched in silence. For Marie, the noise of the crowd must have felt very far away. She had lost almost everything. Her husband was dead. Her children had been taken from her. Her friends had fled or been executed. And the monarchy she had once represented had disappeared. Yet she continued forward. When she reached the Place de la Révolution, she stepped down from the cart. She walked toward the scaffold. And according to historical accounts, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. She apologized. Her final words were simple. She then faced the end of her life. Marie Antoinette was only 37 years old. The Queen was gone. But the story did not end there. Her death became one of the most famous moments of the French Revolution. For some, she remained a symbol of royal extravagance, a queen who had lived far removed from ordinary people. For others, she became a tragic figure, a young woman placed into a political world she had never created. The truth was much more complicated. Marie had certainly lived an extraordinarily privileged life. She had enjoyed the luxury of Versailles. She had expensive tastes. And she was part of a monarchy that was deeply disconnected from the suffering of many ordinary people. But she was also a woman caught inside a rapidly collapsing political system. She became a symbol. And once she became that symbol, her individual actions mattered less than what people believed she represented. Her greatest tragedy may have been that she could not escape the image created around her. The revolution needed enemies, and Marie Antoinette became one of its most powerful symbols. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part of her story was what happened to her children. Her daughter survived, but her young son did not live long after his parents' deaths. He was kept in terrible conditions, and died in prison in 1795. Marie never knew how his final years would unfold. Her family had been destroyed. The royal world she once knew had disappeared. Yet history continued. Years later, the French monarchy would be restored. People would return to the palaces. The names of the royal family would be remembered. And Marie Antoinette would become one of the most famous queens in history. Her life became a warning. That wealth cannot guarantee safety. That power can disappear overnight. And that public opinion can turn against even the most powerful people. She had entered France as a young Austrian princess. She became queen. She became a mother. She became a prisoner. And finally, she became a symbol of a fallen world. But there was still one question history could never completely answer. Was Marie Antoinette truly the villain of the revolution? Or was she simply the most famous face of a monarchy that was already collapsing? Marie Antoinette died in 1793. But her story never really ended. The revolution had taken her crown, her palace, her husband, her children, and eventually her life. But it could not erase her from history. For generations, people argued about who Marie Antoinette really was. Was she a selfish queen who lived in unimaginable luxury while ordinary French families struggled? Or was she a young woman who was placed into a political crisis far beyond her control? The truth was more complicated than either story. Marie had lived a privileged life. There is no question about that. She enjoyed expensive clothing, magnificent celebrations, jewelry, and the extraordinary world of Versailles. But the popular image of her as a heartless queen was also shaped by propaganda. One of the most famous stories associated with her, the claim that she said, "Let them eat cake," is almost certainly not something she actually said. The phrase was already circulating in written form before Marie became queen. Yet the story survived, because it perfectly represented what many people believed about the French monarchy. Marie became more than a person. She became a symbol. a symbol of wealth, royal power, foreign influence, and eventually, the collapse of the old French order. But there was another side to her story. She was a mother. She loved her children. And during the final years of her life, her greatest fear was not losing the crown. It was losing her family. She watched her husband die. She was separated from her children. And she spent her final days imprisoned. The glamorous Queen of Versailles had disappeared. What remained was a frightened mother trying to survive inside a revolution. Her story also reveals something important about power. A crown can make someone appear invincible. But a crown is only as powerful as the system protecting it. When that system collapses, the person wearing the crown can fall with it. Marie Antoinette entered France as a teenager. She was expected to become the perfect queen. Instead, she became one of the most controversial women in European history. Her life was filled with luxury, but also pressure. Her marriage produced children, but also political tension. Her crown gave her status, but ultimately could not save her, and her final years showed just how quickly history can turn. Today, millions of people still visit Versailles. The palace remains one of the most famous royal residences in the world. Visitors walk through the same grand halls where Marie once lived. They see the rooms, the gardens, the mirrors, the royal decorations, and it can be easy to imagine the glamorous queen who once ruled from there. But behind that beauty, there was a much darker story. A young girl arrived in France hoping to unite two royal families. She became queen. She became a mother. She became the target of a revolution. And finally, she lost everything. Perhaps the most important lesson of Marie Antoinette's story is not about whether she was good or bad. It is about how quickly power can disappear, how dangerous public hatred can become, and how easily a human being can be turned into a symbol. Marie Antoinette was once one of the most powerful women in Europe. But history remembers her not because she kept her crown. It remembers her because she lost it, and because her fall became one of the most dramatic chapters of the French Revolution. The Queen was gone. The palace remained. And the world moved on. But Marie Antoinette's name survived. Not as the perfect queen she was expected to become, but as one of history's most unforgettable tragedies. If you enjoyed this story, like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel Sleepless Historian, and watch more emotional royal history stories. Because sometimes, the greatest stories in history begin with a crown and end with a fall.